Episode of Green and Shy with Dan Garms and Alton Erdemir. Tonight our guest is Greg James, the publisher of Marijuana Venture magazine. I had the good pleasure to meet Greg back in 2018 when I attended one of his events up in Seattle. And Greg has been in this industry a long time. He understands it better than most people that I've talked to, and very interesting conferences. And I want to introduce first Alton. Alton, my sidekick tonight, and then we'll bring Greg on. Alton, what do you have to say before we get started, buddy?
Hello. Thanks, Dan. First of all, I want to welcome everybody. Obviously, if you had a chance to visit one of our events and join us on any of the fun times, the panels, you know how important they were, but how much connections were involved. And we've taken things digitally here with our fireside chats. And, you know, Green and Shy, we put it together for a platform to really connect people with opportunity to learn about cannabis, opportunity for training and jobs and careers, opportunity to start a business or learn about how to improve upon your business or connect or even invest in the businesses. And, you know, it's really important that we continue with the content. So I appreciate everyone that's joining us tonight. And you know, I'm glad to have Greg here. It's people like him that are providing the good advice and information from his background that makes it easier for everybody else to cross those bridges that they built before us. So thanks a lot for coming on, Greg, and Dan as well.
So Greg is present with us this evening, audience. We just have a video issue that he can't get on the video, but he's going to be here and we'll be able to ask him some questions later. And we're going to start out by introducing Greg. Greg, how are you doing tonight? How are things in Seattle?
I'm good. We've got our typical sort of overcast Seattle weather right now, but everything's good out here. My employees are, you know, mostly, well, everyone's working from home except me. But the business is going well as far as the magazine. We have had to postpone one of our trade events, which was scheduled for this month. And I'm sure you probably heard that in Washington, the cannabis sales, you know, retail have not really been affected at all as far as the stores being closed. The governor deemed them essential businesses, and they're all open. In fact, they've actually seen an increase in business.
Yeah, I believe that. It's probably a lot like the alcohol business and the liquor business. When times get a little tough, I think people like to relax a little bit more. And then again, it's medicine for many. Greg, tell everyone a little bit about how you got started with Marijuana Venture magazine. I've got an older copy here, but I've lent a couple out. But this is Greg's magazine. It's a national magazine. It's a very good read. I've been getting it for a couple years now, and I really enjoy it. And if you want to stay up to date on what the industry trends are, it's a great magazine to get, and I would highly recommend it. So, Greg, if you could start out and talk a little bit about how you got started in this industry in the publishing side, and where it's, you know, what you've seen in Washington and in the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. Well, basically my background, you know, I was in the software publishing business for 20 years. I actually owned the largest privately owned consumer software company in the US. So I had a lot of experience selling to big retailers, and we published for National Geographic, we did Playboy, World Book, we did Rand McNally, a whole bunch of well-known brands. So I kind of knew a little bit about the publishing business. And that industry kind of went away about, gosh, I guess 15 years ago. So in a nutshell, I was kind of looking for something else to do. You know, I own some real estate. I started to get calls from people who wanted to lease space from me, which I couldn't really do because the buildings were all leased out. But I sort of looked around and just figured there was, you know, room for a real business magazine in this industry. You know, most of the publications were like High Times, you know, they were kind of lifestyle, what do you call it, like culture magazines. And so I hired a guy who was an editor for a newspaper who had a background in journalism. And we launched it as a newsletter 6 years ago. And initially, we just mailed to people who had business licenses in Washington. And, you know, I guess in a nutshell, it just kind of took off. It resonated, and it's done really well. And we got national distribution within 6 months.
And exactly. Could you talk a little bit about your conferences like the one I attended? I think where you run these conferences, it offers great value. We haven't seen much of that in the Midwest, and I'm not sure that our legal system here would allow what they do, but it was kind of cool the way the growers were coming in with jars of cannabis, and you basically set up booths and introduce all the parties together, and they get to try and supply.
Yeah, we do a thing called interchange. And I have to be honest, again, I sort of copied that idea from the CD-ROM business where there was a trade show with the same name. But, basically the idea was you get buyers into one space, right? And the buyers have a meeting room or booth. And then the vendors come by. It's sort of like speed dating for vendors, and they sit down and then they make a pitch to the buyers. They each get 20 minutes and then there's a break. And we schedule meetings every half hour for 2 days. And so, no one had really seen an event like that in Washington. And I think it was the first one of its kind in the country, really, in cannabis. And again, it took off because it became really, really efficient. And it was, a business event rather than a party. And of course, we still had a mixer and all that kind of stuff that was fun. But the point was to really let me back up a bit. Because it's illegal for producer processors to mail product to buyers, right? That was one of the reasons we thought it made a great idea, because people were driving all over the state with samples, and it ended up being a really inefficient way to do business. So when we put all the buyers in one place, the producer processors could come by, make a pitch, and show them the product.
Now, Greg, just on that point, Seattle's a much more mature market. What kind of key things are needed for, let's say, a market like Chicago to be able to do something like that? What things can we look for to kind of duplicate your success with that? Because obviously that helps both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, so the key thing initially is to get the retailers to, the buyers in effect, really, to see the value. And I'm not, I don't really know how it works in Illinois, but, in Washington, the producer processors were driving around, they were dropping off samples. The buyers were kind of inundated, right? And they weren't getting back to the producer processors, rather. And the producer processors were getting frustrated, and it's like, hey, nobody ever returns our calls. They don't check out our samples. So initially, I really approached the biggest retailers, and said, look, why don't we clean this process up? You send your buyer to this event, and I'll arrange to have people come by over 2 days and have meetings with them and pitch them product. And then it's all kind of organized, and they can take notes and have face-to-face meetings, and they're not going to be interrupted. So I guess really in a nutshell, once the buyers bought into the idea, the retailers, it wasn't that hard at that point to get the vendors to see the value and want to participate. So again, kind of key to get the retailers to realize that it's an efficient way for their buyers to evaluate products. And let me add, the first one, we only had about 20 retailers and 20 vendors. But since then, it's grown to about 50 of each, and we kind of cap it at 50.
And you had certainly a lot of people at the one I attended. It was a lot more than 50. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there that day. And you have a lot of booth space as well and sponsors. And I was really impressed with the quality of the companies that were there on that particular day that I visited you and met you.
Yeah, it's, well, the funny thing is out here, Dan, is that, we've been knocked off, obviously. I mean, that's the nature of business, right? So several other companies tried to do exactly the same thing. And they haven't done as well as us. And I think the other thing I would emphasize is it's really important to, the week before the event happens, we spend a lot of time on that, on the schedule, and making sure no one's double booked, making sure that the vendors get the meetings they want and that the buyers get the meetings that they want. It's a pretty, if you think about it, it's, if it's 40 retailers or buyers meeting 40 vendors, with a potential of I think it's 14 meetings per day, right, over 2 days. It ends up that we have to schedule 1,160 meetings over 2 days. So, you know, yeah, it's a lot, right? And we kind of have to do it by hand because there isn't really a good program for doing that kind of a schedule. But, you know, if you do it right, what happens is the retailers end up happy because it's a really efficient way for them to evaluate products. And the vendors love it once they do it once or twice because they realize they get more business done in 2 days than they do in months of driving around the state dropping off samples.
No, that's a great point because it's very hard for some of these, especially the smaller companies that have good product, to get in front of the right buyers. What are some of the, I guess, pointers that you can give the upcoming companies to try to get into something like this? I mean, how does someone get involved as a vendor in one of these type of events?
Well, they could always contact me and I'll license them the rights.
Makes good sense.
And set them up. No, I think one of the other things is that the state's business has to also get big enough, right? I mean, if you only have, I don't know, 20 or 30 retailers or, you know, dispensaries and another 20 or 30 growers, it probably doesn't work. But in Washington, we had at one point 1,100 different growers and about 500 retailers. So it was a kind of an out of balance situation where there were a lot more vendors, right, and producers trying to get into retailers than there were retailers who wanted to see them. So the situation was good there. We are actually doing a show in Oregon, and we're partnering with ORCA, the Oregon Cannabis Association, and we're launching Interchange down there this year. But again, Oregon is a good place because I think there are like 1,000 growers down there and 500 or 600 retailers.
Now, Greg, with everything that's going on, obviously there's interaction with these type of components. Have you seen any changes as far as, I mean, you can't really do these type of sampling virtually. Are there any talks about how people moving forward are going to be able to get their product in front of these buyers with you know, everything that's going on?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. We, you know, so we also do a national trade show called the Retail and Dispensary Expo, which, you know, we've done in Portland 2 years in a row. We're moving to Las Vegas this year. I've had a lot of people say, hey, now it's going to have to be like a virtual Zoom trade show. And, you know, to be honest, I just don't think that'll work. I mean, you can already talk to people electronically via email and text and everything else, right? And the reason people do face-to-face trade shows is because once or twice a year, you really want to actually go meet that vendor or that buyer face-to-face. So to sort of answer that question, we originally had our first interchange of this year scheduled for May 19th. We canceled it, or postponed it rather, and it's going to be towards the end of July. So we're kind of got our fingers crossed that we'll be okay. I think right now it's 50-50, but it does seem like in this state, you know, the whole COVID thing is sort of leveled out, and we're maybe on the downside now. And the governor is lifting some restrictions apparently on, I think on May 5th. So
yeah, I think the key is going to be the process to maintain a clean environment, I guess, for the social things that are going to start to gradually open up. If there's a process, and you know, some places they're going to require gloves and masks at all time. I know here in Chicago, come May 1st, if you can't practice social distancing, meaning you're in an area where there's a lot of people, you have to wear a mask. So, you know, there's things that they're coming up with to allow people to go out, but still protect everybody from each other. So hopefully, you know, that helps out with these type of events, because I know us here at Green and Shy, we're dying to host and have some of these people, but you know, then again, people might still be afraid to even go out afterwards. So, you know, it's going to be there's a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, that's what I just want to say. That's one of my fears, right? Is that we get the okay, but that people still are a little afraid to come, even though we can do it. You know what I mean? They're like, well, I know you're going to do it, and I know the governor said it's okay, and I know you're under the number of people, but I still don't feel comfortable showing up. So I guess we'll see. You know, we're going to play it by ear.
You know, Greg, another difference between Washington, Oregon, California, and Illinois where we're at is that you've got a lot more growers that are approved, but I think a lot of the growers are struggling with their license because they just can't get into dispensaries, and that's where your value has come in. We're approving, I think, another 40 craft grow licenses here by the beginning of May, supposedly, unless the governor postpones it again due to this pandemic. But what's really interesting to me is, do you think that's been a good move by the state government to let so many growers in the market at such an early stage, where they're kind of graduated here a little bit at a time, and I think control it more? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. In Washington, well, as you know, right, Washington and Colorado were the first two states. Colorado, and a lot of people don't know this, Colorado allowed vertical integration, Washington didn't. So Washington was really the most fiercely competitive market in the US by far, right? And they also initially restricted retail stores or dispensaries, if you want to call them that, to about, I think it was 350, but there was no restriction on how many growers there could be. So right off the bat, there was like, this bad situation where you had 350, maybe 360 retail stores and 1,200 growers. There was a huge oversupply here, just like Oregon, and Oregon had the same problem. But anyway, the net result was about 50% of the growers have gone out of business or sold their licenses. So now I think we're at about 600.
That's probably that's righting the market there. Would you agree? If that's at this stage,
yeah,
better for everyone?
Yeah, no, I would, Dan. And I sort of tend to be a guy who believes that, when the government starts restricting business, right, it's not good for consumers. So, but it was brutal, right? I mean, I know people who lost everything, growers, because they to put it bluntly, they just didn't do their homework. They had these grandiose plans and this and that, and they hired a master grower, but they really didn't know anything about commercial cultivation or have a farming background. And a lot of them, they just simply got, the price dropped so quickly. I mean, for example, a lot of people did their, they based their projections on like a $2,000 per pound wholesale price. Well, you could get good bud in Washington for $500 a pound 2 years ago. And so it was brutal for the people who really hadn't focused on efficiency. But anyway, getting back to it, I think it was, I think the way they did it in Washington was fine, and personally, I've never liked vertical integration. I mean, I get that question a lot, like, what's wrong with it? Well, there's a reason they don't let Budweiser own taverns, or McDonald's or Boeing own airlines, or Disney own theaters, right? Generally speaking, vertical integration is bad for consumers. It leads to higher prices.
Good point.
Yeah,
I think this business is going to evolve, Greg, in the next, let's say, 5 years, is we hopefully get legalization nationwide. And how do you think that's going to change as this business evolves?
Well, it's hard to predict. I think we're going to get legalization nationwide for one simple reason. And it's funny, I was talking to an attorney friend of mine. Do you know Charles Feldman in Denver?
I do.
He's a well-known marijuana lawyer there. And he and I were chatting the other day. We're good friends. He had written this piece that was very similar to something I wrote last summer, which basically was that once hemp became legal in 50 states, right? Let me back up a bit. We did a special on CBD in the magazine last year, and I was sent samples of hemp flower that contained CBD. Well, you take that hemp flower out and you compare it to marijuana flower, and it looks exactly the same. It smells the same. So I guess where I'm going is all it's going to take is a couple of arrests where, guys are going to get thrown in jail for possession of marijuana. It turns out to be hemp flower. They're going to sue the cops. The DA is going to go, look, no more are we going to prosecute these things. Because the reality is you cannot tell hemp flower from marijuana flower out in the field. So it's going to lead to false arrests. It's going to lead to, people being busted for growing pot when they're actually growing hemp, and vice versa. And I don't know. I think that's going to be the main thing, right?
Have you seen that documentary? I think it has Woody Harrelson in it. It's Seed to Sale.
No.
It's basically on that point, and I think part of the movie, it shows him planting a hemp seed and purposely doing it because they know the cops don't know the difference and getting arrested to prove a point. So
Yeah.
it's something to look into. It kind of goes along with that same story. It's a few years back, but it's a good documentary to watch.
And, Craig, what has been the trend in actual, growing hemp flower opposed to, doing oils and isolates in the past and distillates? I believe there's a trend there that there's more flower that's smokable in the hemp side today, and that's a trend that I believe will continue. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me quickly go back to the hemp thing. If you were a smart but dishonest and crooked hemp grower, right, in Kentucky or whatever, you could have this giant field of hemp. You could have like a 1/4 acre of high potency marijuana in one corner of it, and no one would know the damn difference. How would the police ever know? So, but anyway, that's a whole nother story. There's I think one of the things with hemp and CBD is we're seeing kind of the same thing we saw on a smaller scale with marijuana growers in Washington and Oregon, and that's a giant oversupply. I know a guy here in Seattle who was a wholesaler of CBD, and he was selling, kilos of CBD isolate for I think $5,500 a kilo last year, and then it came down to about $1,000, and then he got out of it. He's just like, no, there's just such a gigantic oversupply. There's no reason to be even doing it anymore. So, all of these things, right? In just about every form of agriculture, there's a boom and bust cycle. And a lot of people get in and get excited about it, and then there's the shakeout, right? So
we're at the beginning of the shakeout, I believe. I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, all the years I worked in the Silicon Valley structuring startup companies in the tech world before I got into the cannabis industry, the thing you found is high margins at the beginning, high cost of entry, which it is here if you're a large grower and a multi-state operator. I think what we're going to see today is it's about branding, and we're going to see a lot of compression. So when you talked earlier about management, I think it's so important you hire people that are business people with MBAs that know marketing, because it is about branding. In the end, the last people standing, the ones that are going to be bought or do survive, are going to have great management teams because they're going to be operating on razor thin margins. Do you agree with that, or is this just something I'm thinking of from everything I read and the people I talk to in the industry?
Oh, I totally agree. In fact, I would tell anybody in any Midwestern state, you need to come to Seattle and see what the business is really like. Yeah. One of the things that we've noticed out here, I've noticed for the last few years, is the stores that are kicking ass are not the big, fancy, showy stores. They're just like every other retailer. They've got a great location. They've got parking. They've got low prices, and they treat their customers well. And that's, it's like if you look, you can go to this, if you Google 502 data, you can look up every store in Washington and what they sell. And all the biggest stores are basically like the Costco Walmart model. And I hate to say it, but it's a great location with a lot of foot traffic. It's parking, it's all those things that just about any good retailer needs. It's not big, flashy, crazy spaces. And, I think a lot of times, this industry in many ways is like the wine business, there's room for the super high-end she stuff, but 90% of the wines all sell in that $10 to $15 price range. And
what do you feel about what's going on and how it could further affect that? I mean, I think I agree with both you guys. And at the same time, I think what we're going through, this pandemic, is putting a hurt on small businesses, really testing the ones that are organized and the ones that are maybe dreamers. But I think it also is going to hurt the real big people. Some of these big giants that are trying to grow real fast to gain market share before more, people get into the market, because now they're exposed, especially right now when it's hard to generate revenue. You have all these employees, and do you furlough them? Do you get rid of them? I mean, what do you think about that? Because I think this is a good testament and probably going to clear out some of these companies as well, which might make some room for acquisitions as well.
Yeah.
Stock prices are nice.
You know, if you think about it, just about every business is about efficiency. I mean, unless you're, you know, I wrote about this a couple of years ago. Unless you're Ferrari or Louis Vuitton or one of those very, very rare, super high-end brands that can get away with selling stuff for a ton of money because of their name, just about everybody else on the planet is involved in efficiency, right? And just having a great product at a great price. And, you know, the marijuana business is going to be the same way. It's the companies that are going to make it are going to be the ones that have really great management and know how to keep their costs down. And, you know, I think like Dan just said, operate on fairly thin margins and, you know, get there. I mean, maybe there will be a Louis Vuitton or a Ferrari or a Gucci of the marijuana world. But, you know, that I always tell people that takes a shitload of advertising money, right? I mean,
well, there are gold cones that are out there. You can buy gold leaf cones for $6 to $8 each and roll gold joints. So I mean, it's getting there.
You know, Greg, we're just starting to add craft grower licenses in Illinois for the first time. You've got a lot of craft growers out there. Tell us a little about how craft growers are prospering, or are they struggling in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, the number one, so yeah, they're craft growers, and you know, there are definitely growers who are growing for a small number of retailers who want to stay small and are, you know, you could call them a craft grower, I guess, and they're doing fine. I think the guys that are failing are the ones who try to be everything for everybody, right? This industry, we've discovered, is like any other industry. You got to focus. You know, I always tell people McDonald's doesn't make pizza and Pizza Hut doesn't make burgers, and, you know, Boeing doesn't make small personal propeller planes. They just, you know, just about every great business is focused. And early on in Washington, and it's true basically of Oregon too, a lot of people tried to do everything. You know, we're going to grow quality weed. We're going to also grow the lower end brands. We're going to do oil. We're going to do shatter. We're going to do, you know, and it went on and on and on. The number one grower in this state is a company called Fat Panda Grow Up Farms. He does $5 million a month in sales. He's a friend of mine. His name's Robert McKinley, and the guy is razor focused, razor sharp focus on just growing really good flower and being really efficient. He's an indoor grower, but he's stuck with his same formula the whole way through. And if you talk to any of the big retailers, I believe, by the way, he's in every single retail store in Washington except for 5, because I just spent, you know, an afternoon with him at his facility in Spokane a couple months ago. But if you talk to any of the retailers and the buyers, they'll all tell you the same thing. They'll say, Fat Panda has a great sales team. They show up on time. They're never late. They don't smell like they've just been toking up, and they're not stoned. The packaging is really good. It's super consistent. It's always well trimmed. It looks exactly the same, and it's always really high quality. And really, when you think about it, Dan, it's no different than any other industry, right? I mean, whether you like McDonald's or not, when you go get a Big Mac in any city in America, it's always the same. Well, for the quality weed producers, it's exactly the same thing. It's all about consistency and great packaging and being reliable and all that kind of stuff. It really, you know, the marijuana business is no different than any other industry in that respect. You know, the cream rises to the surface, and yeah, we've, you know, been watching it for 6 years. It's kind of funny.
You know, Greg, I read a lot of industry magazines, and I want to ask you, you know, I love your magazine, and why is Marijuana Venture still so popular? It keeps growing, and you still keep competitors coming out, and you guys just have a steadfast audience.
Well, that's because we don't let Ed Rosenthal write for us. No, no, I'm just kidding. I like Ed. No,
I like Ed too.
It's well, because we've really stuck with the whole business thing, right? You know, I mean, again, it's that whole idea of not trying to be anything for everybody. From day one, you know, my deal to my editor Garrett was, hey, we're just going to stick with the business side of things. You know, we're cool with the partying things and the cannabis cups and all that, but that's not really us. You know, we're also cool with, you know, recipes for how to cook with pot, but that's not us either. We're really focused on, you know, articles from people who really have something to say to help others, build their business in a better, manage their business better. And so most of our articles are, of that nature. And that might seem kind of dry to some people, but whenever I go to trade shows, I always have people come up to me and go, God, we love what you guys, the articles in the magazine, they really help us. So it's,
The thing I noticed, Greg, at your events is that the people that are your sponsors that take booth space, that show products, they're products that automate the industry. They're not just some ancillary product that could be it's more of a must-have product to be successful in the industry. And I think that was impressive to me. It was like really well-targeted audience to the people that were trying to sell products there.
Yeah.
Greg, as far as the product, it seems like you have a nice process, and that's obviously key to a lot of success and being able to adapt to different times and different changes. What have you guys been doing? I know you mentioned you got employees that are still getting busy, and it's good that you're taking care of them. What have you guys have seen as far as your changes? I know maybe it's the articles or stories. I know myself, I don't hear as much because I'm usually on the ground in the action, but now, if I don't read it or see it on TV or someone tell me or share with me, I'm not going to find out about it. So what kind of things are you guys doing, whether it's, the content or the type of strategies you guys have to kind of combat what's going on over the next couple months?
You mean like the magazine?
Yeah, the magazine. I'm sure you've changed some of your tactics, being, everyone else is living a different life now.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is our sales have gone way up, right? People are buying more ads, and the subscriptions we're getting more and more subscriptions rolling, and it's kind of incredible. My guess is people are sitting at home and they're reading more. So, because they're not out doing trade shows and parties and all that stuff.
Well, they're sick of listening to the news.
Yeah. It's, honestly, other than the fact that we've had to, postpone, our first interchange event this year, very little has actually changed for us. In fact, it's been kind of fun because we're on the phone and we're talking to and meeting with retailers and growers still, and we're doing a big special issue on extraction in August, and then we've got another one on the whole legal side of things coming up in September. But overall, for me, I've hardly seen any change at all. I think it would have been a nightmare if the governor in this state would have not deemed, cannabis as an essential business. That would have been a disaster, but very little has really changed. It's kind of funny, if you go to the retail stores here, they have big lines out in front of them because everybody's 6 feet apart. But I went to a retailer called Zips just the other day, which is down the street from our offices, and they had this huge line of people at 1 PM, and it was like
essential.
A block long, but 6 feet apart.
Something that's interesting because you guys are the vets. You guys are the dinosaurs of the weed industry, leading the way for us here in Chicago. In Chicago, 3 months ago, you would have gotten a ticket. Well, it was decriminalized, so you only got a $200 ticket, but it went from getting a ticket to essential within 3 months. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And, it shows that times are changing. It's just a matter. Now, if it was federal, a lot of things would be a lot easier, like payments and transportation and things like that. But, it's something that I think is put aside. And I think, Dan, just to let you know, I know you're mentioning something about the May 1st licensing. I think that Pritzker is about to announce that sometime this week that he's going to push that back as well. He lobbied for something.
Yeah, it was pushed back to April 1st, now past May.
Yeah. Well, what can you blame? There's more important things, I guess. Don't tell it to the thousands of people that applied, but.
Exactly.
Greg,
I
was just going to say, in Washington, the gun dealers are pissed because they weren't deemed essential, but pot shops were. I don't know.
Definitely pot is more essential than a gun.
Right.
In my mind.
I just think it's funny. I want my old teachers are at home because their school's closed, and I can go and buy pot still.
Well, I lived in California back in the 80s, and there was a sticker back there that you'd see on cars, and it would say, "Marijuana pot gets you through times of no money better than money gets you through times of no pot, right? It was pretty common sticker back then. Probably true.
What do you think the future is for trade shows? I know we got MJ BizCon, it's one of the large ones. You got Zeninga, I believe the name is, and I've been to a couple of theirs. What do you see the future being? Do you think it's going to narrow down to one or two? Or, I mean, if you look at cannabis conferences around the world, they're running weekly. They're all over the place. There's everybody trying to jump into this business.
Word.
Your opinion, the guy that's been at it for a long time, Greg.
Well, I know some people are going to hate it when I say this, but I think shows like MJ Biz, their days are kind of numbered, and I'll tell you why. Back in the early 90s, Comdex was the world's largest computer show. You probably remember that, right, Dan?
Just go to it.
And, you know, they had 250,000 people would go to Vegas, and 6 or 7 years later, it was gone. The reason it went away was because the game guys said, well, why are we here with all the hardware guys and the wireless guys and the internet guys? We need to have our own show. So they went and did E3.
Yeah.
The hardware guys went and did Consumer Electronics Show, CES. The mobile guys did their own show, and then the internet guys did their own show, and Comdex kind of went away. So the future, I think, of these trade shows is they're going to get specialized, right? I mean, people don't really realize this, but almost no retailers from Washington or Oregon go to MJ Biz because their whole deal is like, well, why would I want to go look at greenhouses and extraction equipment? I mean, that's not what I do. I'm a retailer. Right. And at the same time, I think, you know, cultivators are going to sort of say the same thing. It's like, well, I don't really care about retail fixtures and I don't really care about extraction equipment. I'm a cultivator. So that's one of the things I see. I see these shows kind of becoming much more specialized. And again, it gets down to this thing of efficiency, right? You know, if you're going to go to a trade show and you're a cultivator, you want to talk to nutrient guys and greenhouse guys and whatever, you know, those types of folks, but you don't really care about, you know, investor seminars and extraction equipment and retail fixtures. So, you know, it's like that, right? I mean, most trade shows tend to be pretty focused, and right now a lot of the marijuana shows aren't. So I think that's one of the trends that we're going to see.
I think your model is set up perfectly for the future. We did, when I was working for this company out in Nashville, we did what we called them deal flow platforms, but essentially there were conferences or summits. The only difference is it didn't have all that stuff that, you know, those people aren't going to waste their time seeing, like the greenhouses you're mentioning. It was more so a deal flow platform. There was a few important speakers, but more so it was prearranged meetings. You're there to meet and pitch the person that's a buyer, distributor, or investor in those cases. So instead of having 250,000, maybe it's 2,000, you know, maybe it's 300 buyers and the rest are all two-team vendors, you know, and that's really how people get business done because it allows for, you know, another layer of qualifying. And you already know that. It seems like you're leading the way on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, like I said, it's all about efficiency and focus. You know, the early days of marijuana in every state, when it gets legalized, it's going to be partying and fun, and all these people are going to get licenses, and everyone's going to be, you know, thinking they're going to become green rush millionaires. And I don't want to be the guy who sort of sounds like a wet blanket, but, you know, it's not that easy. I mean, most, you know, even the growers in Washington that are doing well, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, they're still, as Dan said, they're thin margins, right? They're in the ag business. And you know, I always, one of my things I always tell people is, well, look at just about any other form of ag. I mean, take tobacco, for example. I don't think anyone could name a tobacco farmer, but you sure as hell know the names R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris and Walmart and 7-Eleven, right? So the cultivation side, I think, is always going to be pretty slim margins, and it's going to be like ag anywhere, where you're going to have to be damn good at what you do. You're going to need to hire people who know how to run commercial, you know, farming gear, and you know, operate probably on fairly thin margins.
You know, another thought that I have, Greg, is with all of these people in the hemp industry, I've talked to so many farmers. I realize there's a number of companies that are starting exchanges to be a futures market, and exchanges where they've had brokers. I think the farmers are tired of the brokers. I think you'll see an exchange come up that's a spot market to start. It'll be worldwide. There'll be part of it for cannabis, part of it for hemp. And I mean, there's people out there right now that are trying to sell hemp for $40 a pound that basically they're lucky to get 10, because there's people I've talked to recently that are holding 1.5 million pounds, 2 million pounds, 700,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? Because I think there's a bigger glut here than we think, or at least this is my view. And you run a magazine where you talk to even more people maybe than I do. And I'd just be curious to see where that you think that's going.
Well, again, it'll be just like the marijuana growers in this state, right? Where you had 1,200 and it gets whittled down to about half that many.
Yeah.
I also know a couple of people who were grown large quantities of hemp in Oregon and California, and they just let it rot last year. They didn't even harvest it because the price had come down so much they couldn't harvest it efficiently. And, you know, so yeah, it's like every other biz, right? They're going to be, you know, just like in meat, you have feedlots and you have centralized, you know, whatever you call them, factories that process cows and pigs or things. You know, the hemp and marijuana business is going to be the same way, you know, that it's just going to move towards this much more efficient deal. It may turn out that, you know, a state like Kentucky or Missouri are the absolute best places to grow hemp, and that's where it's all going to be grown. You know, I think marijuana is going to be a little different, where you can still have these sort of local, you know, craft type growers. But when it comes to hemp, you know, that's going to be a gigantic commodity crop, I believe, right? And I've already talked to people in Colorado, you know, who'll say, well, yeah, we're growing some hemp in Colorado, but let's face it, growing hemp at 5,000 feet elevation in the high desert is not the ideal place for hemp. Hemp, ideally, you know, because I mean, historically, I believe Kentucky and Missouri were the places where hemp was grown, right? And it's probably the ideal, you know, growing conditions there. That's just my guess, but.
And you know, the market. I'm sorry, Greg. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, when you get federal legalization, I doubt, you know, marijuana is going to be grown commercially in Washington. I mean, I think we're too far north to be a really good state for growing cannabis. You know, my guess is, I mean, again, I'm not a plant scientist, but I would guess that the ideal place for growing, you know, marijuana is going to be somewhere down around Bakersfield, California, where they currently grow all the lettuce and tomatoes and everything else for America.
Yuma, Arizona, where they've got irrigation. I know people growing out there. Imperial Valley in Southern California.
Right.
Greg.
In Washington, isn't it the eastern slope over by Spokane where it's actually better to grow?
Well, Washington is, you know, I mean, as you know, it's a big ag state, and we grow lots of apples and cherries and, you know, potatoes and asparagus, but we don't grow pineapples or avocados, you know, right? I mean, right. Or citrus, you know, and I'm just guessing, but I think cannabis is probably more suited to the sort of Mediterranean climate where you can grow citrus and avocados like Southern California or Texas or Arizona. I may be wrong. I just know that, you know, for example, in Eastern Washington, you can grow really good marijuana here, but you don't have as long a growing season. So the flowering season is shorter.
Right.
So they sort of have to grow cultivars, which is, you know, same thing as strains. They have to grow strains that are better suited for outdoor growing up here. In other words, they flower in faster.
Greg, before we get into questions here, I got a good question for you. Obviously, you know, Dan and I were adverse in our knowledge and background, but we're a little biased. We read up on what we're interested in, and someone that has a great magazine like yourself has to look at the viewership. So you obviously have a greater variety of information. What kind of secrets can you tell us? What was the coolest thing that you've heard recently from one of your stories or articles that we might not have heard of? I mean, you got to have something that you can share before we get to these questions.
Good question, Alden.
God, I'd have to think about it. Well, if you're
Go with the gut.
Well, if you're I mean, if you're in getting into retail, it's really funny. One of the more successful, well, very successful chains in Washington. I had lunch with the owner a few months ago, and these guys are pretty amazing. They're called Zips. They've taken over a few stores and have been able to like double sales in like 90 days. And I was asking him, I mean, like, so what do you guys do that's so different? And he's, well, for one thing, we are razor sharp. We're razor focused on pricing, right? We want to have the best deals. But we also hire really cute bud tenders because we know that, 80% of our customers are guys. So we do the same sort of thing that bars do, right? Which is hire really cute bud tenders who are really friendly and nice. And we've just seen that really leads to sales ramping up really quickly. I mean, I don't know if that counts as a secret, but that's really no different than a lot of other businesses, but it kind of makes sense, right?
I guess that would mean if Alton and I went out and became bud tenders for somebody, business would go down drastically.
I don't know. Speak for yourself. I have my bud tending license, so I could give it a test run.
do you actually need a license in Illinois?
Yeah.
To be a bud tender?
Agency, you have to, there's a few things you have to go. But once they hire you, there's a course you have to test. Everyone has its agency license.
Right. Oh, that's cool. I don't think we even have that out here. I think anyone can be a bud tender.
Well, everyone out here says they are. They know everything anyways, so.
Yeah.
As far as they know.
Yeah, I can't think of any other secrets. I mean, the main thing that I've said earlier, is like be really focused. If you're a producer processor, I think you probably call them that in Illinois, right? Or cultivator. Focus on one thing, I mean, again, it gets back to this whole idea of following the ag model, right? Farmers don't generally grow 20 different crops. They tend to focus on one thing and get good at it. And I think that's, and that's true of most businesses. And I would say for most people in this industry, it's figure out what you're doing and what your product line is going to be and get really good at that product line. And on the retail side, it's figure out who your demographics are and get really good with that. And don't try and be everything for everybody.
And then that kind of goes along with the first question we'll jump into. Vincent asks why the secretiveness is so high in the cannabis industry.
Well, that's not true out west. One of the interesting things we noticed when we first launched the magazine was we would call Colorado growers, and they were really secretive, right? They didn't want cameras. They didn't want to take pictures and all this sort of stuff. And it was never like that in Washington. I mean, we, growers were like, yeah, come on in, take pictures, do whatever, I mean, there were a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, it wasn't really that secretive. You could, I would tell your viewers, you could come out to Seattle right now. I mean, you can go into the stores here that you can take pictures. They don't care. You don't, and Washington is probably more open than almost any other state. Cause I know as recently as just a couple of years ago, with Colorado, you had a waiting area and they called it a dispensary and this and that. Washington's pot shops are just like a 7-Eleven. You just walk in, you show your ID and you got weed and you wait in line and buy your weed. So it's really not secretive.
Yeah, I think it's getting to the point where it's not necessarily just about the product. I mean, I can already tell you a lot of people choose not just based off of product, but packaging already. But I think it's more so based off of knowledge, comfortability, because it is still taboo to a lot of places. So they want to go somewhere that they feel comfortable, they get the help that they need, they have the products that they want. So I think the secretive side is more so, I mean, there is kind of maybe some trade secrets and things that people don't want to know. I think more so maybe on acquisitions of real estate, maybe different areas or cities and markets, because there's no real way to patent anything in this industry unless it's technology. You can't really get a utility patent on a strain of cannabis, right? So, it's kind of more so about working together, but I guess some people are worried about some things like that as well.
So Greg, I have one last question for you, or I have a few more, but this is one that I think is important. What do you think the ancillary markets are that are going to be the most successful? Kind of like if you look at the gold rush selling picks and shovels to the miners, what's going to be the markets that surround and encompass the cannabis and the hemp industry that you see will be very successful, but not as high of an investment to get in, but yet very, very needed and required by the industry for them to do the best they can do?
Well, I can tell you the biz not to get into, and that would be magazine publishing. It's a rotten, low margin business. um, well, I think there are companies doing really well doing delivery services out here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's another one of those efficiency things where you've got these services that have figured out that it's, smart for them to pick up product from a bunch of different growers in Eastern Washington and deliver them to the bigger stores in Seattle. So you've got got these delivery services that are doing pretty darn well. I don't know, there's a lot of law firms doing well, I think lawyers do well just about anywhere, right? But their attorneys are doing well. Let me think about some others. Well, the packaging guys and some design companies, right? So early on, the packaging, again, in Washington and Oregon and the Northwest was kind of rudimentary. It was sort of, plastic bags. And some good designers have come along and done a really kick-ass job with packaging. Again, I get back to that, that example of Fat Panda, who are the #1 brand in the state, right? He's had really good packaging and branding from day one. And it made a huge difference. I can remember many, many times where we would meet with a producer processor and, they'd come into the office and they'd show us their stuff. And I'd be like, this, you might have good weed, but your packaging sucks. It's too dark. It's hard to read. You don't have, things like, I don't know, whatever, good descriptions on it. It's not high contrast, that it's, all the kind of mistakes that people make who didn't hire somebody who really knows, consumer products and good packaging. Now that's kind of changed. It's got a lot more competitive, and now just about anybody who's successful is doing good packaging. But so that's another area, right? Design and packaging, and then marketing. Good, marketing companies, people who can get the product out there. I think there's opportunities for rep groups too that don't necessarily have to actually be. And again, it varies from state to state, right? But there are rep groups now who are taking products from, say the East Coast and repping them to the retailers out here on the West Coast. And, as long as they have good salespeople, some of those guys are really doing well too. They're picking up all kinds of different ancillary type lines.
What do you think the biggest issues are for someone in the edibles side of the market with the supply chain and everything it takes to do edibles?
Well, I've always been very, very, cautious about edibles because I just think that's a very risky business to be in, for the simple reason that I just can't see states really being okay with gummy bears with a drug in them. I don't know. I mean, it's always seemed to me like that's a risky business to be, there's a reason they make drugs taste bad, right? So that kids won't eat them. Traditional drugs. I mean, a lot of pills are made bitter for a reason, so that
that's not
won't
true.
them.
There's that pink stuff that I always got, moxicillin, that tasted delicious, and either bubble gum or grape. I think that was delicious.
Well, maybe like cough syrup, but I think I don't know. I think that I just think it's risky, right? That you might get these states that'll say, hey, look, we just can't have THC in products that kids are going to mistake for candy. But at the same time, I mean, there've been a couple of law changes, I think in Oregon and maybe in Colorado. I don't know. I mean, that's a tough one for me.
Those actually go on the guidelines of marketing and compliance, like being able to market a product, you can't have it something that's kid friendly or show anything that's kid friendly. There's a lot of companies like Philo here, as well as Element One that I know in New Jersey, that do a lot of that, because that's the tricky one. There's a lot of lawsuits that could happen. You talked about other companies, other groups that, are benefiting from this, lawyers, but also marketing as well. But let's jump into some of these questions over here in the Q&A. Here's one from Benny. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, but with Pritzker announcing a halt to licensing in Illinois due to COVID-19, what things should we focus on in trying to start a retail cannabis business in the state? So basically, since they're being halted on their license, what things could they focus on the retail side in the state in the meantime?
You're asking me that?
Well, any of us, any type of information. That's the Q&A from the crowd.
Well, I I wouldn't know how to answer that about Illinois. But
well,
I would.
back when your market was just getting approved, what were some of the things people were doing in the beginning before they got their licenses?
Well, with retail, I'll stress this idea that spend a lot of time researching the location. Companies like Costco and Best Buy and, whatever, the big retailers, they spend millions and millions of dollars with their retail teams looking at demographics of different communities and locations and traffic flow on streets and parking and all that stuff. And there is, again, I would say come out to Seattle or Portland, the biggest stores doing the most business. And there are probably 10 different stores in Washington now that all do over $1 million a month in sales. They're all in really great retail locations. Mm-hmm. They're not destination stores. They're stores like Uncle Ike's is a great example. The owner's a friend of mine. He's consistently got these stores that do sort of, north of $700,000 a month each. He's got 4 of them now, and they're all in really great retail locations where, there's traffic, there's foot traffic. He's close to, an urban setting where there's a fair number of people living there. He's got parking, and every one of his stores just, they're all high volume stores. He spends a lot of time researching the locations. And I think that's really important.
I would agree with you. I had a lot of experience in the tech world in the geospatial marketplace. And I worked with companies that built software that was used by Walmart, used by the big chain stores to determine where they would locate their next store based on traffic patterns. And it was very scientific, actually. So I think the same applies to the cannabis industry, although I don't believe it's nearly as sophisticated yet at this level, but it will get there.
Yeah, it's the retail biz is the same as every other biz, right? Put your store in a really great location and do your homework.
Exactly.
Here's a cool question. It might actually be more prevalent since you're on the West Coast and they're a little ahead of us. And I know pets are really big in California. But what are your thoughts on cannabis for the pet market? And this is from our friend Anna Burns. Hi, Anna.
Well, I don't know. I see there's certainly a ton of CBD products for pets. And again, I don't know about Illinois, but in Washington, you've got CBD products in a lot of the mainstream retailers now, and the pet products seem to be really popular. And I have heard from numerous people who have said that it definitely calms their dogs down when they give them, CBD. Mm-hmm. So that does seem to be, again, it's another one of those growing industries. And I think the companies that are doing well at it are really focused on the pet market. There's a couple companies that are doing a lot of business in that little niche.
Yeah, I think CBD, on the CBD, sorry, Dan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in complimenting what Greg had to say there, I know that the veterinary schools it's much easier to get a trial with CBD and cannabis for animals than it is for a human in this country. So I believe there's a lot of research going on in the animal markets that basically will benefit people with pets.
Yeah, I know Mark, Mr. CBD, he's got, I think, a wolf pack of huskies that are, well, he says they're old, but they look real young. I know he lives off of giving them CBD and different stuff. And from my knowledge, I think some of them dogs are 15 to 19 and they run around healthy, big huskies. I mean, seems to work for them. And, that's something that I think Tony, if you have his information, I know he has some pet products as well, if anyone's looking for him.
Yeah. I actually know a woman who has a dog that has bad hips. And she said that CBD definitely makes that dog feel better and seems to make it a lot more comfortable. So I'm a believer in CBD for pets and for people. I think some of the claims that are made are maybe a little crazy, but there's no doubt it works for all kinds of things like seizure and anxiety and that kind of stuff.
I absolutely believe it in myself. I mean, there's a reason why every animal has an endocannabinoid system. And it's up to us to provide the nutrients for it, right? We have receptors for all these things. And whether it does the miracles that everyone says it does, I think that depends on each person. Just like medicine works different ways for everybody as well. Just like drinking green tea and drinking water works for everyone's different. So I think it's a lot to learn from that. And although we weren't allowed to work on it for the last, 70, 80 years, I think there'll be a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
You know, Greg, we've run out of time tonight, but I would like to have you back again sometime in the future, because I think we could go a lot deeper on a numerous group of subjects that would be very interesting to our audience. Would you be welcome? Would you come back and see us again sometime?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I'm happy to kind of talk about, some of the stuff we've learned out here in 6 years of legalization. It's been a fascinating business for me to watch. There were things that happened that I didn't think were going to happen, and things that happened that I thought were going to happen. But it's been, we've learned a lot. So yeah, I'd love to.
So, Greg, I'd like to thank you for being our guest tonight on Green and Shy. Alton, as always, great to be with you tonight. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and we appreciate you coming and watching our show every week. And we look forward to you joining us next Wednesday night between 7 and 8 for our next show. And we'll be announcing probably by tomorrow who our guest speaker will be. So thank you for tuning in, and we appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Ciao for now.
Ciao.
Thanks
Greg,
for having me.
you.